I'm going to begin by thanking all of you for taking the stage and also saying welcome to Tim Peters, who was not presenting but is actually was quietly in the presentation, as he is the project leader of Annabelle, the final project that we saw of Test Site Rotterdam. Such a vast number of questions raised that I'm going to just try and give a start for a first round for you all to start engaging with one another. I think there are two things that struck me very much in the presentations here, which is that the social role and the moral conscience are two things that became very prominent. And I would almost say that you showed us almost the beginning of that in architecture. But I'm also seeing it very strongly present in a completely different fashion in the projects we saw. So perhaps maybe we can start with a response from Franziska on this very cheerful new development in Rotterdam and the moral conscience you see in that.
The development in Rotterdam, in the urban space, not on the pedestrian area, but on a level where you see the city in a completely different way. Well, my association, taking into account two terms, communication and identification, I would say these are communication spaces that people identify with. And again, when I look back into history, when I think of the Rue Galerie, I see this kind of link. So it's not about reiterating historical examples, but unconsciously there is a kind of continuation. Sometimes you are referring to a historical model. Sometimes it just happens spontaneously, unconsciously. My question to the two of you, the Débit Ceinture as Promenade Plantée in Paris, on the ring roads, or the High Line in New York, were these inspirations for you, or were these stimuli for you? Was there any influence of these projects in order to implement your fantastic project?
I think very, very much so. And maybe not always 100% conscious or directly, but I think the main idea behind the Yellow Bridge is really giving the city back to the pedestrian, not just the pedestrian, but also in Dutch you call it flaneren, the leisurely pedestrian or the leisurely walking. Rotterdam is quite strolling. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And while strolling, you can discover all these different places that are now being connected to each other. And then, so I think very much the High Line, of course, is maybe the most recent good example of this, but we've surely also in Rotterdam, you mentioned the Petit Ceinture in Rotterdam, you have along the harbor the Boompjes. It was in the, I think, 19th century. It was one of the only cities where along the harbor sides there would not only be industry but also living, and the people who lived in the houses loved to stroll along the harbor and see the activity, and actually the still work. So we maybe more directly, rather than grabbing ideas from far away, I guess it was informed much more by things already present in Rotterdam. Also, the trajectory of the bridge actually is an overlay of a very old plan of singles and by W.F. Rose, who was one of maybe the first city planner of Rotterdam, already laid out this plan, and it never got built, and after a while sort of got forgotten, and this bridge is an attempt to sort of revisit the old ideas of this pedestrian network. So yes, it was very much informed by
does this plan of Rose, which you are reusing, come into the does this historic plan of Rose, one of the first city plans, come into the conscience of the people who are storing on the bridges? Are you giving some information how a city of the 21st century is rooted in history?
I don't think that it will directly, but the effect might, or hopefully will, that we also, the single plan also until the combination of green structures in the area. If you look at the plan of Rotterdam, then you can see that the Hofplein and where we are located is actually kind of this gap. And we try to reconnect not only the pedestrian walkways, but also the green structures. And I think the relevance to the High Line even gets more to the point when you know that the Luchtsingel is connecting to the Hofplein line, which is also a derelict old railway station that is on the verge of redevelopment, or so we hope. And that really has the potential, and is kind of the promise also of the project of the Luchtsingel, that it connects to this old railway station and this railway line that stretches on 2 kilometers into the north of the city and connects Rotterdam with the hinterland. And it creates one direct route from the central station all the way into, well, Dutch nature, but nature nonetheless.
Actually, I found perhaps in also your presentation the most presence of these objects. So the comment that I wrote down from your presentation is when you said, you know, once something starts happening, then it kind of, the happening continues. And I think this to me also struck a chord with what all of you were saying, that in a way it's not just these ideas, because these ideas stay somewhere, but the actual physical objects that become that. And perhaps I would be a little curious to hear in this spectrum of hopefulness and resistance what you think of this project as producing in the city. Their project, the test site Rotterdam. Yes.
Sprechen mit mir.
Mit Sie, ja.
Ich verstehe kein Wort Englisch.
I don't understand a word of English, so I'll try to rephrase it in German. My German is not too good, but I'll give it a try. We talked about the dialectics of hope and resistance at the end of your talk, and I see the hope embedded in the objects you create. And I was wondering, what do you think about this project test site in Rotterdam? What do you think of it? I still didn't get the question.
Ihre Frage habe ich nicht verstanden.
You've seen this project, or the project.
Aber die fand sehr interessant.
They were very interesting, these projects.
Interessiert mir Ihre Art, vorzugehen in der
The way you proceeded in the city, that seems to create unique opportunities.
Ist mutig.
It's very courageous and it's very interesting. What I liked particularly was that you said several times, this is about temporality. It's not a final, eternal, permanent state. It's a process that can find an end, can be revitalized again. But sometimes these first projects will give birth to new projects. Or it's a project that is here to stay. So for me, that's the incarnation of utopia. Utopia doesn't mean for me reaching an ultimate goal. It's a stimulus for change. And this is what I see in your project.
Yeah, I like the link with what Mr. Snozzi showed, that architecture is always permanent. And I also hear from the room, it's not very permanent. And I think that we have a slightly different take, as Franziska Bollerey is kind of, I think, also getting at, that the bridge is also a test. The municipality wants to make this structure. If you ask Calatrava to do it, it will cost you millions and millions and millions. And now we have, and it will take you years and years and years. And now we have something, and we can see, does it work, and can we get things going again? So it also becomes more interesting, maybe in the end, to ask Calatrava to design this bridge. So it might not be about permanence, but it's about getting there step by step, and especially keeping things going, because we've seen with our own eyes that if you don't do anything, then at least this area wasn't getting any nicer. So I think that's the main drive, and not so much creating something permanent.
If I may comment, the Luchtzingel is of course famous for its process. So people come together to build it together. And I very much admire that. But as I'm a designer, and I would say that the design of the things itself is actually equally important. What you are looking for as designers, or your office, is something that most people would call urbanity, which was lacking there. And my definition of urbanity would be a lot of people connecting to each other, a lot of different people, but also connecting to the same things, to have a new place in mind. And the Catalan architect and urbanist Manuel de Sola Morales once very precisely said, the skin of the city, that what we perceive, is very important because it enables or disables. And the precise design enables you to be, that you like to be there. It also enables you to connect over the railway. So it's not only programming, it's not only the process, it's the precise design not only in its connections, but also in the form you gave it and the material you gave it and how you perceive it if you use it. So that's why I like the project, because it shows, yes, design can change, maybe society is a big word, but it can change the situation there, or the panel is called create a situation.
That's true. I was kind of wanting, before we take this to the room, to briefly get back to the form of utopian thinking. I think we saw two presentations, in fact, where one was very clear about the history of utopian form. The social role is fundamental to Owen, Fourier, Gaudin, and I think you are positioning a social role in scenario thinking, but it's a little more careful, I saw from your presentation. And I'd like to hear a little more about that.
Well, there are different kinds of images of the future, types of images of the future. If one designs, one needs an image of the future. Otherwise, you cannot design. You can produce, but you cannot design or plan, which means think ahead and then take the steps. We usually do visions, we draw options, we use forecasts. These are three very usual types of images of the future. But I focused on the other two types, which is utopia and scenario, which is not the same. A utopia is not connected to the present. Morus locates it far away in space. Usually in the millennial utopia, it's located far away in time. More often it's both very far away. The utopia is a counter-image to the present. It's a reflection of how things could be different. A scenario is something that shows a plausible and vivid development into the future. And it need not be something that we want, but something that we think could happen, and we show it in a way that, as Herman Kahn called it, it's an ersatz experience. We only need it when we don't have a reference image, actually. Then the reference image is better. But if we don't know it, we need a scenario. And what I tried to sketch out, that there are different ways of using scenarios. One is internally in a design process. All of the designers will know that you try to think step by step how things could develop, and then you draw your conclusions upon your design. But the second way, how it's used more and more often also, is that you use it as a communicative tool to the outside. And then it very often turns to propaganda, or it fails because people think that what you show them as a scenario is what you want, or what you forecast. And so I think that these are two very different types, and they both have their uses. And The counterintuitive conclusion that I drew from my research on scenarios is, for communication to the outside of a design team, I recommend utopia. Why? Because utopias are very clear about the underlying values. You can really communicate about why you choose what and how it's connected to your values. And the scenarios you should keep internally because they're almost hardly communicable outside the team.
Franziska, do you also agree that utopia is situated not in the present but elsewhere? I remember something about the Defizite in Gegenwart. That's
Die Begriffsbestimmung der Utopie.
The definition of utopia, and here I agree with you, is related to the spatial utopias. Morris is one example, kind of placing yourself outside the current geographic condition. And the second definition of utopia is the utopia of time, the transposition of a vision from of an ideal society into the future. These are the two paramount definitions of the term utopia. There, of course, are many overlaps, but in a way, you always have to base yourself on the two definitions when you talk about utopia. I was very happy that Sola Morales was quoted here, because his theoretical and practical approaches to produce communication do not just have a spatial component, as he did in Barcelona. He established a communication between the city and the sea. There used to be a separation, and he undid that, like you developed this kind of communication in Rotterdam. Or think of Scheveningen, how he used the boulevard in order to link the hotels of the city with the sea. It has nothing to do with utopia. I just wanted to say something good about Manuel, who unfortunately passed away. So, jetzt gehe ich mal ins Publikum und schaue mal, ob es da bereits Fragen gibt.
Wahrscheinlich war es ein ganz schön langer Tag.
I mean, I'm happy to keep, all of you talking.
Sie können natürlich hier oben weiter sprechen.
Ich hätte mal eine Frage, und zwar
I've got a question.
finde ich ganz interessant die Idee.
I think it's very interesting, the idea of that master plans can generate communication with the inhabitants of a city, and the Dutch example that we've seen is very interesting, where Rotterdam is like an experimenting box, if you like, experimentation box, or has acted as one in the past. It seems to me that this project meant that there was a lot of communication, and that the city itself changed a lot. It sort of represented certain utopias. So it's my sense that there was a very public debate about architecture in the Netherlands, one that I don't really see in Germany. And I wonder how one could connect that to what's happening in Berlin at the moment, and how Berlin is developing as a city, and how communication via architecture could perhaps work better, or at least have a platform, and whether utopias or scenarios might be of interest to this city, and to what extent are they disappearing here in the way history disappears. You know, the Palace of the Republic, Palast der Republik, which was pulled down, where the East German Parliament was, and now something else has been put up, and how we can deal with that.
That was a really long question. And I have to admit I'm not specifically, I don't really know what's going on in Berlin, of course, but I think you have to be always somewhere local to really know what's going on. But I do know that in the Netherlands we were really jealous for a very long time about the way Berlin, we use the term bottom-up, which I think is a sort of complicated term now, but we're really jealous about how in Berlin they actually make the people take their city back, basically. They reclaim the public space very much. I think
Rotterdam was called Berlin on the Muse for quite some time, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So
just because of this,
it's great you say that you're impressed by the Dutch examples, because it's the other way around works the same way, I think.
But I think regarding your other, as I see your question about communication to the people, it other has another side, that because we're so evolved, we're now kind of being held responsible for what is happening. So there's another side to that as well, that people come to us and ask, hey, what's going on here? Why don't you do something about it? And so communication is a very tricky thing, and I think that's something that we're also learning still about how to communicate what you're actually doing. And the image is a very powerful thing. We made some provocative images, and we also made some images for the campaign, and people usually take images very literally. We even noticed that scenarios for clients very difficult, because when you show them 3 options, especially if you draw them in a computer program, they think that that's a proposal, that you're saying that we should build that. Even if you show them 3 different versions, they still think, no, that's not it. So it's a difficult thing, and I wouldn't have any advice for you right now. Sorry.
I want to,
maybe I'll
if
give
I can
it a
add
try.
one last thing. What I really like about the German discourse, I think, where it talks about this, is that there's a very, very strong debate on gentrification, I think. The after effects of things like the test site, they can have bad side effects. I think nobody knows the outcome, but it's dangerous to, it can lead to displacement, for instance, in the city, or further separation. In the Netherlands, this discussion is almost absent at the moment. I think it will come, but it's not really an issue. We've luckily in the Schrijver I've managed to sort of de-gentrify by keeping the rent for the people in the Schrijver low for much longer than it would have if they would have developed. So there you could say
5 to 10 years.
For 5 to 10 years, there's no skyrocketing rents, for instance. But I know pictures from people that put billboards outside of their windows with no gentrification in my neighborhood, which is, I think, they have a very active people, which I think is a very important ingredient for city making or place making.
Rotterdam is the only city that I know that has as a vision for its master plan gentrification as a positive thing that has to be achieved by the city administration. You should know that. So there's a different point of departure, maybe. But about communication and participation, these are very big words, but you have to be very careful who communicates what to whom and who participates. Utopia is very attractive to discuss about because utopia is stable. It never evolves. And that's why people might want to see it as a vision. And most people want to keep things as they are. And the main point of a city is that it evolves, it changes, because we change and we grow and we die and somebody else comes. And part of the gentrification debate has to be seen under that light. So is it about stopping the time because we're afraid of death, or afraid of rising or rents or dropping values of the ground? And the second thing is about participation. Most participation, I'm afraid, are just an alibi, sort of to share a bit responsibilities with the people who come, and then in the end take a decision together, which is not true. So the relation, what I tried to show also with Almere and Bijlmermeer, is the public control of design and planning is a political responsibility. And it has to be, in the end, decided on the political field, and not in the sideshow for some people who have the time to participate. And I think that's where it has to go back, urban development, into politics, because that's what our politics were made for.
Okay. Can I just...
I I'm seeing questions rising quickly in the audience, so I'm going to take the question that had come first. I'm sorry if I can, please hold your thought and let me pass
well,
this
that's
to...
hard.
Oh.
That's really hard for me, to hold my thoughts. hold my voice is
the lady
easier,
is giving you your turn, so please take it. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Well, it's about the last point that Christian addresses. So if, like you said, for the internal communication, the scenario is better, and the utopian presentation is better for the outside world. Underneath this this advice, there's an idea about the morals you were talking about. So the scenario is a managerial tool. Do you agree with that? A managerial tool?
I think it's a thought experiment. It's not necessarily managerial.
Okay, so it's on the creative level.
It's an ontological instrument.
Okay, but then again, when you want to imply and involve values in your presentation, in order for your the one who gives you the commission to take a stand, can you use scenarios? And if you use scenarios, what is the main ingredient to convince them? In other words, their choice, as the two guys from SUS explained, is always felt as a choice you have to live up to, another proposal. But that's exactly the issue we are talking about. You are proposing something that changes their mind and their lives, not a managerial tool to make a quick buck. So how do you convince them, as in the earlier days, and Adriaan Geuze can tell you a lot about this, you convince the one who gives you the commission that he has to change his mind in order to understand what you were talking about. So how do you convince the one who gives you the commission?
I think you raised a very important point which we did not discuss today, which is that as a designer, you have to sell your design to someone who pays for it.
Yes, that's the first
and
layer.
That is something that we haven't discussed today, but the designer itself...
You have to convince someone to pay for your design.
Yes, exactly. And we, as designers, we don't have the resources. And of course, a scenario is a story. And with a story you can sell things, and that's how scenarios are used also in our field.
But the scenario also involves you, per definition. It's not a model, it's not a blueprint. There's something different. In the scenario, you have to participate. You are one of the participants once you choose for a scenario. You can't outsource a scenario.
Well, we should discuss that in the pause, I think.
Okay, that's too hard, yeah, all right.
All right. Shall we move on to our next question? Has it been?
I'm not sure after what he said if my question can be answered. I only know scenario from futures studies, and from there it's a very participating method used to find different futures. And I found it very interesting that you're using it in architecture or in design. I think it's a great tool, and to be honest, I don't understand why you're saying it's an internal tool and just go out and sell utopia to the public, basically. I feel you're using scenario technique in a way that's undervalued. I think it's a very strong and very good communication tool, actually. So that's my question, why?
Very good question. There are many people very fond of scenarios and using them on a daily basis, and we do that too. I study historic cases of some relevance in the Netherlands, and I also use scenarios in my teaching and in my own work. There are a couple of reasons why scenarios are so difficult. The first reason is it's, by definition, a plausible and vivid description of a possible future development. It combines certain and uncertain elements. You know all that, I just repeated. It doesn't need to be something that you want, but that could happen. Once you communicate with someone else, you start to think about what you want and what the other person wants. And then two things usually happen. One thing is you present a scenario, and the other person says, oh, if that's what you want, you're crazy. Because they didn't understand or didn't want to understand in a debate that this was just a radical path that you sketched out to come then to a conclusion. The other thing that happens is, oh, this is going to be bad. So you're forecasting something that's really disaster. And you say, no, that's a scenario. But our minds do not work that way. They usually see it as a threat or a trend as threat scenario or as something that you want. And I don't want to sell utopia, but I think utopia is also an experiment of the mind that can pose the what-if question that scenarios are so much about in a more transparent way, including social values and their consequences, because that's what it's about. The debate about utopia is far away from the market. That's not how you can approach a client. But that's if we go into the public debate, and I think urban planning is a lot also about politics, you should think about how we want to live and what kind of society we want. And I think that's much clearer if you look at the family stair or if you look at Brave New World, because it's very clear what the consequences are. And the last point about scenarios, that's the main weakness of them, is they're social constructions. You have to construct pieces that are recognizable into a story that is new. That's why it becomes plausible and vivid at the same time. That leads to two things. First of all, every part that you assemble is not questioned. So you use the material that's there. There's no real innovation in scenarios per definition. The second thing is, to be plausible, there has to be continuous development in some way, even if there are breaks. Everything that's unexpected, that's open, that's new, maybe that's a result of freedom, cannot be told through scenarios. And these are two very big reasons why they are difficult in outside communication. If you're an expert on scenarios, it's different, I would say.
I've got a question. I've just got a question to Christian.
Okay, alles klar.
Okay, fine.
Und zwar an die zweite Referentin hatte ich schon eine Frage.
Oh, wait a minute. I had a question here. Someone else is saying. I'm sorry, somebody was actually already asking a question before you started. Can I? Am I allowed to? Or what's happening? Yes, Christian, I'm going to ask you in German. Go ahead. Now, we were talking about this earlier, and you touched on this again briefly. The whole question of the client. And what's interesting in the Netherlands, or at least in the 90s, it was the case, and at least that's how I understood it. There were cultural institutions that were set up to instigate this dialogue via scenarios and to foster this debate. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon, not least in the question that Katja posed as to whether we could deal with this approach in Germany somehow or other. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the role of institutions, cultural institutions particularly. And then selling something is always an issue that focuses on moderation. I don't think scenarios themselves, well, I think they work quite well as a communication instrument, but it's just a question of how you sell them, how you sort of moderate the entire process. Perhaps you could say something about your perspective here about the role of the moderator, which isn't necessarily the designer of the scenario. I just don't know whether you can separate the two, or whether you should even separate them. But what role does the moderator have, and what role do the cultural institutions have? Let me answer the second question first. Images for your own life. When you are presenting them, I think when you're presenting these images, the moderator can do a great deal, but then the images go out, and then you can't control them anymore. And scenarios can have a huge impact. The most important scenario of French spatial planning was something that Data had done. It was Scénario de l'inacceptable. It was a sort of threatening scenario, and it defined the regionalization of today's world, because it basically said if you do this, the whole country is going to be split into winners and losers. That image is still there, even if it was only a radicalized exercise in scenarios, but it triggered such a lot of fear that it's still there. In terms of the institutions in the Netherlands, I believe in Berlin at the moment, in terms of institutions and funding, we're doing a lot better than the Netherlands are, considerably better, because I don't think in Germany, well, possibly they've understood that there's been a radical cultural revolution from top down. The conservative government has cut a lot of the funding in the Netherlands. And in the 1990s, of course, there was loads of money for such projects, and there was a great deal of positive energy, but this is gone. I mean, the world looks rosier with hindsight than it was. I mean, there was a real split in the Netherlands into 4 parties, and each party had their TV channel, their trade union, their radio channel. They had their own construction companies, more or less. They had their own schools. And into the 50s, these 4 leaders basically sat down and decided what was going to happen. And they had ways of implementing it because they had a whole structure. And it was only in the 60s that everything changed and there was real uncertainty. And as fate would want it, the country became quite rich through gas deposits that were discovered. And the first response was to allow a great deal of freedom, and that led to a sort of flourishing of the thick layer of the government, you know, institutions, ad hoc institutions, festivals that tried to sort of get a sense of this space or fill this space, but tended to navel gaze. And historically, this time is long gone.
I'm going to, what a morbid conclusion, but yes. Anyway, I would like to pass the question on to the gentleman. No, is it passiert? Is it all done? Okay. Let's see, has anyone else? Yes, I see one more question in the back, if we can get a microphone there. There.
Hören Sie mich? Doch? Ah,
can you hear me? Hope so.
Hallo, mein Name ist Anna Rexer.
I'm Anna Rexer. I'm a designer myself. And my question works on, well, it's targeted to something Mr. Salewski said, that the designer needs an image of the future to be able to design. And as has been the case a couple of times in the course of the last 2 days, I've had to ask myself the question as a result, to what extent is design responsive and to what extent is it proactive?
Das ist ja auch eigentlich die übergreifende Frage der Veranstaltung.
I suppose that's, you know, the whole question of this conference is, can design change society? And of course, it can only do something like that. It can only change society if it is active, proactive. And yet we keep suggesting that design and designers are service providers, that design is a service, that it's just a response. Originally, a designer was an artistic advisor. So how can you bring, you know, to what extent is the role of the designer today a proactive one? And to what extent is it just reactive? That's essentially my question. I'd like to hear what you would say to that. Well, I would say active designers, proactive designers are sitting on this panel. Ways in which, through your own initiative, you can actively respond. But I wouldn't want to go into that. I wouldn't agree with your dialectics of the proactive and the reactive. And I think also the image of the future I was referring to doesn't have to be one that will last for the next 100 years. It could be what you want, how you want to decorate your table when your guests come for dinner tomorrow. You know, I think you could, of course, just set the table and design the table as you go. But I think the whole point of design is that you are thinking ahead of things a bit, and it's much more interesting to respond to a dynamic image than a statical image. And this is why these scenarios trigger resistance, because they're one way that we know of thinking through things into the future. I think it's Robert Owen who took things further and further. When society came too close to his utopian housing estate, he would move further somewhere else because he wanted a standstill. He didn't want dynamism. And I think that designing, incorporating dynamism is difficult. I also wouldn't want to have an antipodian situation between action and reaction. I think you respond actively to deplorable states of affairs or vacancies or social problems, whether it's gentrification that you're trying to combat or whatever it is. For me, the result is I respond actively when there is a deplorable state of affairs.
I might be missing the point slightly because my German is not that good, but I think what for us it might be relevant to this discussion is that it's not only about the small scale action, but it's also about the vision or the scenario or the utopia, how you want to call it. That well, for want of a better word, like the top down as well as the bottom up. We spoke on that briefly earlier, that it's not just, hey, let's do something, let's small scale beer garden over there, but that when you're working on it, you also think about what do I want to achieve in the end, and what is the vision for this area, or for this city, or for this. So the small scale action is a means to an end and not a means to itself. Okay, but I might, that was my interpretation of your discussion.
Actually, we have time for just one more question, and I saw the hand already being raised over here, so please, yeah, the microphone is coming.
So this means that the minimal option for utopia is one scale higher. The minimum option for utopian thinking is just think one scale higher than the scale you have to perform, right? If you're a Dumbo, that's not a problem, just one scale higher. If you have 6 brain cells, only 2 more. So it's not thinking it's not something for the elitists or the very intelligent. I work in urban spaces, on schools, Turkish, Moroccan, very deprived situations. And the mothers of those kids are working in the schools, very high participation. The only thing that I want from the mothers, they work in the school, they get a volunteer, kind of volunteering money. But for them, because 30% lives below the threshold, the armoedegrens, the poverty threshold, right? So the money is the first scale. The second scale, of course, is their kids. They work there because in doing what they are doing, they are assisting in the kitchen, in the gardens, and so on. They improve the schooling of their kids. That's the second scale. But I want them to raise one more scale, just one more scale, to understand that their kids are preparing themselves for an independent life, right? Which is a big utopian thing. But for those women, this is exactly what they want to understand. So utopian thinking is not a big thing. Utopian thinking is very contextual and very small. But it is a matter of reflection. And it's not a matter of reflection, bottom up, top down, well understood, boys. Not bottom up, not top down, but it's a circle. Sometimes you're bottom up, sometimes you're top down, and then you're a bottom up, and you're a top down. So this circularity, that's exactly what happens when you make a scenario, I think. It spiralizes in a way. So I think we should just get utopian thinking back where it started. On a very small scale, just one scale higher.
Actually, since that is such a clear analysis, I'm not going to ask our speakers to respond to that, but I am going to give the floor for one final question, if that is still there, to one of our organizers. So please.
I just want to ask one question to Luigi Snozzi. Because I think you discussed kind of now on the pen.
Auf Deutsch?
Yeah, Entschuldigung.
Then you should ask it in German. Mr. Snozzi, of course, in German. I would like to ask you a question. On the panel, we've talked about just how important the relationships between the architect and the client, the architect and the public sphere is. You've given us an example from a while ago, and more recently, but we worked in Monte Carlo many years ago, and you were in a situation in which you were working with a public authority, and you were developing this area over a long period of time. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what kind of an experience that was for you, what played a role for you. A few words, and yet covering many years. I really don't know what I should answer, but perhaps what I can say is what I did there recently, and that was in my village, Monte Carasso. In my little village, there were 250 rules and regulations regarding construction. I was able to reduce them from 250 to 7 rules and regulations. And of these 7, one has not actually been written. It's just a verbal agreement, but it still counts. And it's an important rule. So that's my work, really. I think that without talking about the rules and regulations, you're not going to make any progress. So I think this is the case. And the work that I've done there in this little village, it had 1,500 inhabitants. Now it has 5,000 inhabitants, so it's grown a bit. But still, it is impossible to do something if you leave the old rules and regulations in place. And to change the rules and regulations, you have to really, really do a lot, because that's the hardest thing there is. So all my work is about changing these rules. Unfortunately, there's not much time left for actual architecture. But I think that architecture is something that's important to Berlin. I mean, in Berlin, everybody's talking about the world of tomorrow, the projects, but no architects. Isn't that wonderful? So the main subject that we're talking about here, architects, aren't even here. So then I asked myself, why? Why are architects running away from the work that they should be tackling? That's how I see it.
This actually sounds like the best closing comment we could have, so I would like to thank you for that.